The courthouse in Carver County smelled like old wood, and the particular kind of cold that settles into buildings where too much human misery has passed through to let the air stay warm. Nora Calloway sat in the third row of the gallery, not at the long table where the attorneys bent their heads together and murmured in the private language of people who are paid to reduce lives to paperwork, but back here, where she had been told to wait. She was 74 years old. Her hands were folded in her lap in the careful, deliberate way of a woman who has spent the better part of 5 decades making sure she occupied as little space as possible. She had been doing that for so long she had stopped noticing it was a choice. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The gavel came down at 10:47 on a Tuesday morning in October. The judge read the decree in the flat, practiced voice of a man who has read too many of these to hear the weight in the words anymore. The marriage of Clyde Renford Whitmore and Nora Jean Whitmore, formerly Calloway, is hereby dissolved. Dissolved, like something dropped in water, like something that had never been solid enough to break only to vanish. 48 years. She had given Clyde Whitmore 48 years. She had married him at 26 in the white clapboard Baptist church in her hometown of Greer's Hollow, Kentucky, on a June morning so hot the candles bent sideways in the still air. She had been Nora Jean Calloway, then the third daughter of Ray and Estelle Calloway, granddaughter of Earl Calloway, who had been the most quietly remarkable man she had ever known. She had worn her mother's pearl earrings and a dress she had sewn herself from ivory crepe, and she had looked at Clyde Whitmore standing at that altar and believed with every quiet chamber of her young heart that this was the right thing, that this man would be worthy of the life she was preparing to build with him. For a long time, she had not been wrong, or at least, she had not known she was wrong, which amounts to the same thing when you are living inside it. Clyde had been handsome and certain in the way that young men from good families sometimes are certain, not because they have earned it, but because no one has ever required them to question it. He had worked in insurance for 30 years, risen steadily, been reliable in the ways a husband needed to be reliable when the children were small and the bills arrived on the first of every month without fail. They had built a life together on a piece of land outside Frankfort, a white farmhouse with a wide covered porch, a half-acre vegetable garden that Nora tended every summer without complaint, a barn they had converted over the years into something her daughter called charming and her son called impractical. 3 children, 2 grandchildren, 48 years of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings, and the particular quiet of 2 people who have lived together long enough that silence is its own form of conversation. She had not seen it coming. That was the thing she could not make herself say out loud to anyone, even now, that she had not seen it coming. The woman's name was Deanna Phelps. She was 51 years old, recently divorced herself, and worked as a bookkeeper at the insurance company where Clyde had spent the last decade before his retirement. Nora had met her twice at company functions over the years, a small, precise woman with careful hair and a habit of touching her earrings when she laughed. She had not thought anything of her. She had not thought anything of anything, because she had been busy doing what she had always done, tending the life they had made without ever examining whether it was being tended equally in return. She found out the way women find out. Not through some dramatic confrontation, not through a letter left carelessly on a counter. She found out because Clyde told her. Sat down across from her at their own kitchen table on a Thursday evening in February with his hands flat on the wood, and said, in the steady voice of a man who has rehearsed this, that he had decided he could not continue living a life that no longer felt honest. Not a life that felt dishonest. A life that no longer felt honest. The difference mattered to him. She had thought about that distinction for many months afterward. He had been seeing Deanna for 3 years. What followed was not, as Nora had initially believed it might be, a period of grief followed by resolution. What it was, in fact, was a systematic dismantling. Clyde had retained an attorney named Barlow Finch 3 weeks before that kitchen table conversation, 3 weeks during which he had continued to pass the butter at breakfast and ask about her rheumatism and kiss her cheek before bed. Barlow Finch was known in Frankfort legal circles as a man who specialized in asset protection for high-net-worth divorcing spouses, which was another way of saying he was very good at making sure women like Nora walked away with as little as the law could be persuaded to allow. The farmhouse had been purchased under Clyde's name alone in 1981, during a period when such things were simply done that way without anyone explaining to a 27-year-old woman why it might matter later. The joint savings account had been drawn down considerably in the 18 months before the filing business expenses, Barlow Finch explained serenely, entirely legitimate, well documented. The land, the barn, the 40 years of Nora's labor poured into both, none of it showed up in any document with her name beside it. Her own attorney, a kind and overworked woman named Connie LaRue who handled family law out of a small office above a dry cleaner, had been honest with her from the first appointment. Nora, I'm going to fight as hard as I can, but I need you to prepare yourself. This man had a 3-year head start on this divorce. By the time you knew it was happening, the paperwork was already done. She had prepared herself. She did not know, until the gavel fell, how little preparation had actually helped. She walked out of the courthouse into an October wind that smelled of dead leaves and coming rain. Her daughter, Priscilla, had offered to come. Nora had told her not to. Her son Marcus had not offered at all. He had called the night before with a careful, measured speech about how he loved both his parents and wanted to stay out of it, which Nora had understood to mean he was choosing a side and was too polite to name it aloud. She sat in her car, a 9-year-old Buick that had not been in Clyde's name and therefore remained hers, and she stared at the steering wheel for a long time without starting the engine. She was 74 years old. She had $140 in a checking account in her name alone. She had 2 suitcases in the trunk, the clothes she had packed when she moved out of the farmhouse 6 weeks earlier into the back bedroom of Priscilla's house in Lexington. She had her mother's Bible. She had her reading glasses and her blood pressure medication and a thermos of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. She did not cry. The tears, she had discovered over the past 8 months, had a kind of limit to them, and she had used most of them up in the early dark hours of mornings when Priscilla's house was quiet and there was nothing to do but feel the full weight of what had been done. She sat in the car for a long time. And then, because there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to go, and because sitting still had never once in her life solved anything, she reached into the back seat and pulled her mother's Bible into her lap. She had not opened it since packing it. She had carried it the way women carry things that belong to the dead, not to use them, but to keep them close, to have something to hold that had been held before by hands she could no longer reach. She opened it to no page in particular, the way her mother had always said you should open a Bible when you were looking for something you couldn't name. A folded piece of paper fell into her lap. It was old. The edges were soft with age, the fold lines nearly translucent where the paper had been creased and unfolded many times. She opened it slowly. It was not scripture. It was a legal document, a property deed, handwritten in the precise, ink-heavy script of a county clerk from another era, and dated March of 1961. The property described was a parcel of land in Greer's Hollow, Hart County, Kentucky, measuring approximately 1/3 of an acre and including a single-story stone structure previously used as the county holding facility, commonly known as the Calloway Jailhouse. Transferred to Earl Desmond Calloway, in full ownership, no encumbrances. Below that, in her grandfather's handwriting, a note so brief it almost seemed incidental. Nora, this is yours when you need it. You'll know when. Grandpa Earl. Nora sat in the courthouse parking lot and read the deed 4 times. She knew when. She had been 7 years old the last time she sat inside the Calloway Jailhouse, perched on a 3-legged stool, while her grandfather Earl moved around the small stone building with the quiet efficiency of a man who considered every space a workspace. The jailhouse had not been an operating jail by then. Hart County had built a proper facility in the county seat years before, but it sat on the corner of Mill Road and Sycamore Lane in the center of Old Greer's Hollow, and Earl Calloway had owned it for as long as anyone could remember, and he had used it in the years after its official closing for purposes nobody in the family had ever fully understood. She remembered the smell of the place more than anything else. Wood shavings and linseed oil, and the faint mineral coolness of old stone. She remembered the sound of her grandfather's tools, the low rasp of a plane across a board, the clean knock of a mallet. She remembered the way he worked slowly, unhurried, as though the thing he was making was already finished and he was simply uncovering it. She had not been back to Greer's Hollow in 31 years. The town had been her grandmother's funeral, and before that, occasional summers as a child, and before that, The slow geography of a life that pulls people away from small places and rarely brings them back. Clyde had never liked Greer's Hollow. He had found small towns claustrophobic, had called the people provincial, had made his discomfort clear in the polite, reasonable way he made all of his dislikes clear, not with cruelty, but with a consistent, low-level friction that made it easier over time to simply stop going. She had simply stopped going. She had not realized, until this moment, what it had cost her. She thought about what her grandfather had told her once, the summer she was 12, sitting on the wooden steps of the jailhouse while he sharpened a chisel on a whetstone with long, even strokes. He had said it the way he said most things, quietly, without preamble, as though the thought had been waiting in the air and he was simply releasing it. Nora, a man can take your money, and he can take your house, and he can take the years you gave him. But he cannot take what's been put away for you. What's been put away waits. It always waits. She had been 12. She had nodded without understanding. She understood now. She folded the deed carefully back along its original lines and placed it in the inner pocket of her coat, close to her chest. She started the car. She pulled out of the courthouse parking lot onto the main road and turned north, away from Frankfurt and Priscilla's spare bedroom and Clyde's farmhouse with its porch she had painted twice and its garden she had watered for 4 decades. She did not stop to think about whether this was rational. She had been rational for 48 years and rationality had not kept her house. She drove. Greer's Hollow was 147 miles from the courthouse in Carver County, and Nora drove all of it on two-lane roads through the Kentucky interior because the interstate felt wrong for this kind of journey. She needed to see the land change around her, the rolling fields giving way to limestone outcroppings, the hardwoods thinning toward the ridge lines, the particular blue-gray quality of Kentucky sky in October that she had not looked at properly in years because she had been living in a life that did not require her to look up. She stopped once at a gas station outside of Harrodsburg, filled the tank with $60 she could not afford, and bought a cup of coffee from a machine that dispensed it into a small paper cup in a color that bore only a philosophical relationship to actual coffee. She drank it standing beside her car in the cold wind and felt, for the first time since the gavel came down, something that was not grief. She was not sure yet what it was. It was small and fragile, and she did not want to name it too quickly. She had learned, in the past 8 months, that hope was a thing you had to approach carefully, the way you approach a bird that has landed close enough to touch gently, without sudden movement, or it will be gone before you knew you had it. She got back in the car and drove. The roads narrowed as she moved further into Hart County. The pavement gave way eventually to a chip-and-seal surface that rattled her tires pleasantly, and then to two-lane blacktop lined with old stone walls and stands of cedar that pressed close on both sides like something leaning in to listen. She had not been on these roads in 31 years, and she knew them anyway. The body remembered roads. It remembered them the way it remembered the shape of a grandmother's kitchen or the weight of an old quilt, not through the mind, but through something older and harder to locate. She came into Greer's Hollow from the north, the way she had always come as a child, riding in the back of her father's truck. The town had changed and had not changed in the way that small places change. The gas station was different. The old hardware store had become something calling itself an antique mall. The Baptist church where she had married Clyde had a new sign out front and a fresh coat of white paint. But the bones of it were the same. The same narrow main street, the same limestone storefronts, the same way the hills cupped the town on 3 sides and the creek ran along the 4th and made everything feel like something gathered rather than scattered. She parked on Main Street in front of a diner called Hazel's that had almost certainly been there for 50 years and walked in with her coat pulled close and her deed in her pocket. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 60, broad and unhurried, with reading glasses pushed up into silver hair and the particular ease of someone who has been standing behind the same counter long enough that the room has shaped itself around her. She looked at Nora the way people in small towns look at strangers who are not quite strangers, with the careful, patient attention of someone trying to place a face they almost recognize. She poured coffee without being asked and set it across the counter. Nora wrapped both hands around it. "I'm looking for a property on Mill Road," Nora said. "An old stone building. It belonged to my grandfather, Earl Calloway." The woman behind the counter was quiet for a moment. She set down her coffee pot very deliberately. Then she said, "You're Earl Calloway's granddaughter?" "I am." The woman looked at her for a long time with an expression Nora could not immediately read. Then she pulled off her glasses and polished them on her apron, which Nora would come to understand was what this woman did when she was organizing her thoughts. "My name is Ruth Adair," the woman said. "I own this diner, and I have been looking at that stone building on the corner of Mill Road every day for 30 years. She paused. "Honey, everyone in this town has a story about Earl Calloway, and every one of those stories ends the same way. He was the best man any of us ever knew, and whatever is inside that building, he meant for someone to find." Nora's throat tightened in a way she did not try to manage. "Nobody's been inside?" she asked. "Not since he sealed it up." Ruth said it the way she might say the sky is blue, a plain fact, a thing the whole town simply knew. "He closed it up sometime in the late 80s, boarded the windows himself, put a padlock on the door, and told anyone who asked that he was keeping it for someone." She paused again. "We didn't know who. Some people thought maybe one of his children, but none of them ever came." Nora reached into her coat pocket and laid the deed on the counter between them. "He left it to me," she said. Ruth looked at the deed. She looked at Nora. And then she did something that Nora had not expected. She reached across the counter and placed her hand over Nora's, the way women do when words are the smaller gesture. "He would have been glad it was you," she said quietly. "Come eat something first. Then I'll walk you over there myself." Nora ate a bowl of potato soup she didn't taste and half a slice of buttered cornbread. Ruth called a man named Doyle Puckett from the hardware store and told him to bring his bolt cutters down to the old Calloway place because Earl's granddaughter had finally come home. Doyle arrived within 10 minutes, a lean man in his 70s with a white mustache and the unhurried manner of someone who has never once needed to rush to make an impression. He shook Nora's hand and said, "Well, that is something." And that was all he said, but the way he said it made Nora feel that it was enough. The three of them walked together down Mill Road in the thin October light, Ruth on one side and Doyle a few steps behind, and Nora in the middle with her hands in her coat pockets and her heart doing something she did not quite have a name for. She saw it from half a block away. The Calloway Jailhouse sat on the corner of Mill Road and Sycamore Lane like something out of another century, which it was. It was built entirely of local limestone pale gray blocks fitted together with the careful masonry of people who understood that permanence mattered, with a low roofline and two small barred windows on the front face that had been boarded over from the inside with rough planks. The front door was solid oak, iron-banded, with a hasp and padlock that had rusted almost to a single fused piece over decades of weather. Climbing vines had made their way up the north wall and spread across the top third of the facade, and tall grass grew around the foundation up to knee height, and the old iron hitching post at the corner had tilted at an angle that suggested it was testing how far it could lean without committing to falling. But the structure itself was solid. The limestone walls showed no cracking, no bowing. The roof, low-pitched, covered in old tin that had gone the color of the hills, had no sag, no collapse. It stood the way things built by careful hands stand, with the quiet, unhurried permanence of something that did not need to announce itself. Nora stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. She thought of her grandfather Earl, his wide hands, his patient eyes, the way he had of making every silence feel intentional rather than empty. She thought of the 7-year-old girl who had sat on a stool in this building and watched him work and not understood yet what she was watching. She thought of the deed folded in her coat pocket and the note in her grandfather's handwriting. "You'll know when." She knew when. Doyle stepped forward with his bolt cutters. He looked at Nora once, waiting for her nod. She nodded. The bolt cutters bit through the rusted hasp in a single clean motion that produced a sound like a declaration, sharp, final, with a ringing echo that moved down the empty street and disappeared. The padlock fell into the grass. The iron hasp swung loose. Nora stepped forward and put her hand on the iron door handle and felt beneath her palm the cold of metal that had not been touched in 30 years. She breathed in. She breathed out. She pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. Wood shavings and linseed oil and the cool mineral breath of old limestone, the exact smell she had carried inside her without knowing it for 67 years. It moved through her like a current, like something electrical traveling up from the soles of her feet and arriving in her chest without warning. And for a moment, she could not move at all. She simply stood in the open doorway with one hand still on the iron handle and breathed it in, and it was so precisely the smell of her grandfather that she half expected to hear the low rasp of his plane across a board coming from somewhere deeper in the room. Doyle stood behind her at a respectful distance. Ruth had gone quiet beside him. Nora stepped across the threshold. The main room of the jailhouse was larger than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply smaller in her memory of it. A 7-year-old girl with short legs and an enormous capacity for wonder. The ceiling was low, bare limestone overhead, with heavy timber beams crossing it at intervals, and what light came through the 2 front windows that had been boarded, casting the room in a layered dimness that her eyes took a moment to adjust to. What emerged from that dimness, as her sight settled, was not what she had expected. She did not know, honestly, what she had expected. Ruin, perhaps. Decay. The wreckage of a space that had sat sealed for 30 years. What she found instead was a workshop. A long wooden bench ran the full length of the left wall, solid and low-slung, built from heavy oak planks that had been smoothed by decades of use to a surface as even and warm as skin. Above it, a pegboard hung from floor to ceiling, and on that pegboard, arranged with the kind of deliberate organization that speaks of a mind that finds peace in order, hung tools. Chisels in graduated sizes from narrow to broad. Planes of 3 different weights, their blades still wrapped in oiled cloth. Draw knives and spokachaves and marking gauges and things Nora could not name, but recognized the same way you recognize a face you have not seen since childhood, imprecisely, but with certainty. A hand drill with a rosewood handle. A set of carving gouges nested in a leather roll. A mallet, round-headed, its handle worn dark where a hand had gripped it thousands of times. Every tool still hanging exactly where Earl Calloway had placed it last. She moved into the room slowly, the way she had learned to move through things this past year, carefully, without rushing toward what was coming, because she had learned that what was coming deserved to arrive in its own time. The floor beneath her was wide plank pine, worn to a pale honey color and swept clean in the way that surfaces swept with genuine care become clean. In the far left corner, a small cast iron stove sat on a square of hearthstone. Its door shut, a small stack of split wood still arranged in a neat pile beside it, ready to burn as if someone had set it there yesterday and stepped out for only a moment. On the shelf above the stove, a row of tins she recognized, the square, flat kind her grandfather had kept labeled in his hand with their contents. Linseed oil, beeswax, Japan dryer, turpentine. In the center of the room, pushed slightly back from the workbench, stood a tall stool she remembered. 3-legged, the seat worn to a smooth bowl by years of sitting. She had perched on that stool as a 7-year-old girl and watched her grandfather's hands move across with the way other children watched magicians. Along the right wall, behind a low wooden rail that served as a kind of partition, she could see the jail cells, 2 of them, side by side, set into the far end of the building. The iron bars were still in place, dark with age, and the heavy iron doors still hung on their original hinges. The cell nearest her stood open, its door pushed back against the wall. Inside it, instead of a cot and a bucket, she saw shelves, rough board shelves fixed between the bars and the stone wall, and on those shelves, wrapped in heavy muslin cloth, shapes that resolved themselves as her eyes adjusted. Long shapes and round shapes and flat shapes, each wrapped with the careful attention of something being preserved rather than stored. The second cell was closed. Its door was shut and latched, and through the bars she could see only darkness and the faint impression of shapes she could not yet make out. There was no padlock on the latch. It required only the pull of a handle to open, but something about it made her stop. The second cell felt different from the first. The first cell had been left open, accessible, prepared for discovery. The second cell had been closed deliberately, with the considered purposefulness of someone deciding that this particular thing should wait a moment longer. She would come back to the second cell. For now, she turned back to the main room and let herself simply be inside it. Ruth appeared at her shoulder with the quiet practicality of a woman who understands that the best support is not commentary but presence. She had brought a lantern from the hardware store, a battery-powered thing, modern and bright, and she set it on the workbench and turned it on, and the workshop bloomed into full illumination for the first time in 30 years. Nora pressed her hand flat against the surface of the workbench. The wood was smooth and cool and real beneath her palm. On the far end of the bench, set carefully apart from everything else, was a folded piece of paper. She recognized the fold before she reached it. She had spent a lifetime learning to recognize the particular way her grandfather folded things squared at the corners with the precision of a man who considered even small acts worth doing correctly. She unfolded it. The handwriting inside was Earl Calloway's, the same hand she had seen on the deed, but looser here, more personal, the way people write when they are writing to someone they trust completely. "My Nora," the note began, and she had to stop reading for a moment. She breathed slowly and deliberately. Then she went on. "If you have found this, then the thing I always feared most for you has come true, and I am sorry for it. I want you to know that I saw you clearly from the time you were very small. I saw the softness in you that the world mistakes for weakness, and I knew it was not weakness at all. Softness of the right kind is simply love that hasn't hardened yet. It is still capable of becoming something. I built this place for you. Not all at once, not in a single intention, but over many years the way things worth having are built, slowly, in the ordinary hours, out of ordinary materials. What I have left here is everything I know how to give. It is not everything the world would call wealth, but it is everything I would call it. Do not try to understand all of it tonight. Rest first. The building will still be here in the morning, and so will everything inside it. I kept the stove drawing well. There are matches in the tin on the left shelf. Wood enough for the night in the basket beside it. In the storage cell you'll find the cot still made up. I was always an optimist about the future, Nora. I always believed you would come. Use the key that is with this note for the morning. Love always, your Grandpa Earl." She looked down. Beneath the folded paper, on the surface of the workbench, lay a small iron key. Shorter and more slender than the key to the front door, with a simple bow and a single bit worn smooth with age. She picked it up. She turned it in her fingers. She looked across the room at the second cell with its closed door and its deliberate darkness. "Morning," she told herself. Like he said. She tucked the key into her coat pocket. Doyle and Ruth stayed for another hour. Doyle, who it turned out had spent considerable time in this building as a boy watching Earl work, it was where half the men in this town learned anything worth knowing about their hands. He said simply located the flue handle on the stove without being asked and opened it, checked the chimney draw by holding a lit match near the opening, and pronounced it clear. He built the fire. Ruth had apparently anticipated a longer stay than Nora had planned and produced from a canvas bag a container of leftover beef stew, a half loaf of bread in a paper sleeve, a thermos of hot coffee, and 2 thick wool blankets she said she had no particular use for. Nora accepted all of it without protest. She had reached the age and the circumstance where refusing practical kindness was a luxury she could not afford. Before they left, Ruth stood in the doorway with her coat buttoned and the cold October evening at her back, and looked at Nora standing in the warm lamplight of her grandfather's workshop. "There is a woman named Cecily Marsh," Ruth said. "She's 82 years old and lives 2 streets over, and she was one of your grandfather's oldest friends in this town. She's going to want to know you're here. May I tell her?" "Yes," Nora said. Ruth nodded. "I'll bring her tomorrow." She paused. "Your grandfather was a good man, Nora. A genuinely good man. I want you to know that we felt the loss of him here for a long time. Some of us still do." She paused again. "Good night." "Good night," Nora said. Doyle lifted 2 fingers from the brim of his cap. The door closed behind them. And then it was just Nora and the fire and the low warm light of the lantern and the smell of linseed oil and wood smoke and the quiet of a building that had been waiting for 30 years and was finally, without urgency, exhaling. She ate the stew sitting on the 3-legged stool with the bowl in her lap. She drank 2 cups of Ruth's coffee. She watched the fire through the small glass window of the stove door and did not think about Clyde or Barlow Finch or the farmhouse or the gavel or any of it. She thought about her grandfather's hands. She thought about the note and the key in her pocket. She thought about the second cell with its closed door and its careful darkness and the something inside it that was waiting for morning. She slept on the cot in the open storage cell, wrapped in Ruth's blankets, and she slept better than she had in 8 months. She woke to birdsong and the particular gray-gold quality of early October light finding its way through the gaps in the boarded windows in thin, pale lines. The fire had burned to cold ash. Her back ached from the cot, but not unbearably. She lay still for a moment, looking up at the limestone ceiling above her, listening to the town of Greer's hollow wake up around her, a truck moving down Mill Road, a dog somewhere, the sound of a door closing. She was 74 years old. She had $140 and a thermos of cold coffee and 2 wool blankets and an iron key in her coat pocket. She had never in her adult life felt more like herself. She got up. She rebuilt the fire from the wood beside the stove, moving through the motions her grandfather had taught her when she was 11. Paper first, then kindling, then the smaller split pieces, and by the time the flames caught properly, she had the coffee reheated on the stove top and a plan for the morning. First, the boarded windows. She found a claw hammer on the pegboard, Earl's claw hammer, its handle worn to the dark color of old tea, and began working the boards loose from the inside, starting with the 2 front windows. The nails came out reluctantly, the way nails do after 30 years of settlement, shrieking against the wood as she levered them free. She took her time. She did not rush. Each board that came away let in another column of pale October light, and by the time she had both windows uncovered, the workshop was transformed, still cool, still stone-walled, but alive now with the particular generosity of natural light. She stood back and looked at the room. In full light, she could see it properly for the first time. The workbench, the pegboard with its organized tools, the stove in its corner, the shelves her grandfather had built along the right wall carrying their labeled tins, the stool in the center of the room, and at the far end, the 2 jail cells, one open, one closed, set into the stone like the last question in a long conversation. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She went to the open cell first. She moved down the row of muslin-wrapped shapes on the rough shelves slowly, unwrapping each one with care. They were wooden objects, finished pieces, worked to completion with the patient craftsmanship she had watched her grandfather practice as a child. A small side table with turned legs. The joints fitted so cleanly that when she pressed at the corners, she could detect no movement at all. A box, roughly the size of a shoebox, inlaid on the lid with a pattern of light and dark wood in a compass rose design, its hinge still swinging smooth and its interior lined with green felt. A candlestick holder carved from a single piece of walnut, the grain of the wood following the turning of the form in a way that seemed less like design and more like something discovered inside the material that had always been there. There were 14 pieces on those shelves, 14 separate finished objects, each wrapped individually, each perfect. She unwrapped them all and set them in a row along the workbench, and then she stood back and looked at them and felt something move through her chest that was not grief and was not quite joy but lived in the neighborhood of both. He had been making things all those years, quietly, without anyone in the family knowing the scope of it, or perhaps knowing and not caring enough to pay attention. Earl Calloway had been in this building making things of genuine beauty and genuine skill, and leaving them wrapped in cloth against the day someone would come to find them. She thought about what a man like her grandfather would have known, intuitively, about the value of things. He had not been an educated man in the formal sense. He had left school at 14 to work. But he had been educated in the way that people who pay close attention to the world are educated, by observation, by practice, by the slow accumulation of understanding that comes from doing something with your hands for 50 years. He would have known what his work was worth. He would have known that 14 pieces of this quality, made by hand from selected hardwoods, with joinery of this precision, were not nothing. She was not, however, thinking about money as she stood at the workbench. She was thinking about her grandfather at 70 or 75, working in this building alone while the town of Greer's Hollow moved around him outside, wrapping each finished piece in cloth, placing it on the shelf, building towards something, toward this, toward her, toward the morning she would come and find it waiting. She was thinking about what it means to love someone across time, to prepare for them, to believe, without any certainty, that the preparation will one day find its intended. She went to the second cell. She put her hand on the iron door handle. She felt the cold of it, the same iron cold as the front door handle the evening before. She pulled. The door swung open on hinges that had been oiled. She could tell by the smoothness of the swing, by the absence of the protest she had expected, and this small detail made her close her eyes for a moment. He had oiled these hinges. He had known someone would need to open them without difficulty. She opened her eyes and stepped inside the second cell. It was larger than the first and completely unlike it. Where the first cell had been converted into open shelving, practical, accessible, Organized for a workshop, this one had been finished. There was no other word for it. Finished. In the way that a room is finished when someone intends it to be beautiful rather than simply functional. The walls had been whitewashed, the limestone brought to a clean, even brightness that held the morning light coming through the single small barred window near the ceiling. A pine floor, narrower boards than the main room, had been laid over the original stone nailed in place with such precision that she could not find the gaps between boards with her thumbnail. A small wooden desk sat against the right wall, plain and well-made, with a single shallow drawer and a chair behind it with a woven rush seat. On the desk, arranged neatly and covered by a single piece of oilskin cloth, were 3 stacked journals. Beside the journals, a flat wooden box the size of a large book. On the left wall, hung with a simple nail, a single framed photograph. Nora crossed to the photograph first. It was black and white, formal, the way photographs were formal in another era taken in a studio, with a plain background, the subject seated and looking at the camera with the slight self-consciousness of someone not accustomed to being photographed. The subject was a young woman, perhaps 20, with dark hair pinned up and an expression that was not quite a smile, but was too warm to be called neutral. She was wearing a cotton dress with small buttons at the collar. She was holding something in her lap that Nora could not make out at first, a small, indistinct shape. Then she saw it. It was a 7-year-old child. The child was looking not at the camera but up at the young woman, with an expression of total absorption, total trust. The child was her. She recognized the small, stubborn set of her own child jaw, the particular way her younger self had sat, slightly pitched forward, as though always on the edge of leaning towards something interesting. And the young woman was her grandmother, Ida Calloway, 30 years younger than any photograph of Ida that Nora had ever seen, luminously young, and looking down at the child in her lap with an expression that Nora understood now, from the far distance of 74 years, was the expression of a woman in the specific pain of love, which is the knowledge that the thing you love most is also the thing most capable of being hurt by the world. Earl had framed this photograph and hung it in this room. He had made this room for her. He had finished it for her. He had left her photograph on the wall for her. Not a photograph of himself, not a photograph of the family as a whole, but this one, this particular one, of Ida Calloway holding 7-year-old Nora with that expression on her face, as if he had understood that what Nora would need most, at the end of a life that had taken too much from her, was simply to see evidence that she had once been held by people who knew exactly how much she was worth. She sat down in the chair behind the desk. Her legs had gone uncertain in a way that had nothing to do with her age. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the photograph on the wall for a long time. Then she reached out and lifted the oilskin cover from the 3 journals on the desk. The journals were bound in dark green cloth, their spines labeled in Earl's hand. She opened the first one. The initial entry was dated 43 years ago, in the spring of the year Nora had married Clyde Whitmore. It began, "Today my Nora married a man I do not trust." I did not say this. It was not my place to say it. She is a grown woman and she has her right to her own life and her own choices, and I love her enough to respect both even when it costs me. But I am writing it here so that something in this world knows I said it. I do not trust Clyde Whitmore. He is a man who considers a woman's love a thing he deserves rather than a gift he has been given, and those men do not tend to learn the difference until after the damage is done. I have been thinking for some time about what I can leave her that will matter when the time comes. Not what I want to leave her. What will actually matter? I am an old man with a small building and a set of tools and 40 years of practice in a trade nobody thinks much of anymore. None of this sounds like protection, but I have been turning it over in my mind for months, and I keep arriving at the same place. What a woman needs when a man has taken everything is not sympathy. It is not even justice, though God willing she might have some of that too. What she needs is ground. Real ground. Something solid under her feet that belongs to her, and only her, and that nobody had any part in building except the people who loved her. I am going to build her that ground. A little at a time. In the ordinary hours. The way things worth having are built. Nora set the journal down. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and held it there. She sat very still in her grandfather's finished room in her grandfather's stone building in the town where she had been born, and she breathed through the thing that was moving through her, which was grief and gratitude, and something so old and deep it had no name she knew. He had known. 43 years ago, on her wedding day. Earl Calloway had sat down in this room and begun keeping a record of what he was building for her and why. She sat for a long time before she reached for the flat wooden box. It was latched a simple brass clasp, no lock, and she opened it without ceremony, the way she had learned to open things in this building, steadily and without bracing against whatever was inside. Inside the box, lying on a bed of dark velvet, were 3 items. A folded document, heavier paper than the deed she had found in her mother's Bible, with the raised seal of Hart County on its face. Beneath it, a passbook from a small county savings institution, the cover worn soft as cloth. And beneath that, lying flat, a single brass key larger than the one she had used on the second cell, with 3 cut teeth and a tag of brown paper tied to the bow with a piece of twine. She unfolded the document first. It was a deed. A second deed, not for the jailhouse, but for a parcel of land adjacent to it. 22 acres of mixed timber and pasture running east along Sycamore Lane, with the mineral rights retained in a notation at the bottom in Earl's hand that read, "The creek on the eastern boundary has never run dry in living memory. You will want that." She opened the passbook next. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading, because the balance printed on the most recent statement dated 2 years before Earl's death was a number she had never associated with anything she personally owned. She read it 3 times. She set the passbook down on the desk. She picked up the key with the brown paper tag. She turned it over in her hands and read what was written on the tag in Earl's careful, squared lettering. Basement, it read. Go to the northeast corner. Press the 3rd stone up from the floor between the 2 support beams. I left you something down there from the beginning. I didn't want it where anyone else might find it first. Nora looked around the finished room. There was no door to a basement visible. She went back to the main workshop. She walked its perimeter slowly, examining the floor, the walls, the baseboards. She pulled the heavy stool aside. She moved the firewood basket. She looked at the flooring beneath the workbench. And then she found it. In the far right corner of the room, partially concealed beneath a false panel of pine boards fitted so precisely into the floor that it read as a continuation of the floor itself, visible only because she was looking, only because she had been told to look, a square wooden hatch, perhaps 2 feet across, with a small iron ring set flush into the wood. She crouched down beside it. Her knees complained in the way they complained now at angles they had once managed easily. She ignored them. She fitted her fingers through the iron ring. She pulled. The hatch lifted on a set of hinges that had been oiled the same way the cell door hinges had been oiled, smoothly, without resistance, without drama. Cool air rose around her from below. The smell of earth and old stone drifted up, and beneath it something she could not yet identify, faint and sweet, like honey left a long time in a wooden box. A narrow wooden staircase descended into the dark. Nora sat back on her heels and looked down into the darkness of her grandfather's basement, and felt the key in her hand and the passbook in her pocket and the photograph of her grandmother on the wall in the finished room behind her, and she understood, with the clarity that comes only at the far end of a long and difficult road, that she had arrived somewhere she had been heading her entire life without knowing the destination. She went back to the workbench. She found the lantern. She lit it. She returned to the hatch. She descended. The lantern light bloomed around her as her feet found the bottom step, and Nora stood still for a moment, letting her eyes do the slow work of adjustment. The basement was dry. That was the first thing she registered. Not damp, not the musty rot she might have expected from a sealed underground space, but genuinely dry, the air cool and still and clean in the way of old stone that has never let the water in. Her grandfather had built well, or chosen well, or both. Earl Calloway had never done anything carelessly enough to be surprised by the consequences. The space was roughly the same footprint as the main workshop above, and it was not empty. Along the left wall, floor to ceiling, ran a series of deep wooden shelves, each shelf fitted with a lip at the front edge to keep things from sliding. On those shelves stood mason jars, dozens and dozens of them, sealed with wax, their contents visible in the lantern light. Some held honey, amber dark and clear as glass. Others held what she recognized as dried herbs, carefully labeled in Earl's hand. Others held seeds in small paper packets tucked inside the jars for protection, each packet dated and named. Along the right wall, a different arrangement. Here her grandfather had installed a series of flat wooden drawers, shallow and wide. the kind used in old map rooms or print studios. She counted 12 drawers. Each one was labeled on a small card tacked to its front face. She crossed to the right wall first. She pulled open the top drawer. Inside, lying flat and protected between sheets of acid-free tissue paper, were drawings. Precise, detailed architectural drawings done in pencil on heavy drafting paper elevations, floor plans, cross-sections of buildings she did not immediately recognize. She pulled one out carefully and held it toward the lantern. The title block in the corner read, "Proposed Renovation, Calloway Holding Property, Mill Road, Greer's Hollow, Kentucky." Dated 31 years ago. Her grandfather had drawn renovation plans for the jailhouse. Detailed, professional quality plans showing every room, every dimension, every structural change he had envisioned. She pulled open the next drawer. More drawings, furniture designs this time, rendered with the same precise care, each piece annotated with species and joinery details. The side table she had found upstairs in the open cell was here, drawn in 3 views, with notes about the cherry wood he had selected and why. The inlaid box was here. The candlestick holder. She opened the 3rd drawer and stopped breathing. It was full of money. Not loosely arranged, not chaotically stuffed. Organized, the way Earl organized everything, in banded stacks laid flat in rows. Old bills, the kind with larger printing and older portraits, bundled in rubber bands that had gone brittle with age. She did not count it immediately. She simply looked at it. Then she carefully closed the drawer and stood with both hands flat on its face and breathed slowly, in and out, until the room steadied around her. She opened the 4th drawer. More stacks, newer bills this time. The 5th drawer the same. The 6th held a different kind of paper certificates, she realized as she lifted the top one carefully. Stock certificates, old ones, from companies she did not immediately recognize. A folded letter on top of them was addressed to Earl from a man whose title was printed as investment advisor, dated 26 years ago. Earl, it read, "Per our last conversation, I have attached the current valuation of the portfolio as discussed. As of this date, the combined holdings represent a conservative estimate of," and here a number was printed that Nora read once, set the letter down, picked it up, and read again. She sat down on the bottom step of the staircase. She held the lantern in one hand and the letter in the other, and looked at the number until it stopped being a number and started being a truth she was required to accept about her own life. Her grandfather had been quietly, methodically, over the course of 40 years, building something. Not for himself, he had lived simply. Everyone in Greer's Hollow would tell her later, simply and without display, the way men of his generation who had come from nothing sometimes chose to live when they finally had something. Because the simplicity was not deprivation but a form of pride in knowing the difference between what you needed and what you merely wanted. Not for his children, who had received what he felt was fair and appropriate, and had been told clearly that the rest was spoken for. For her. For Nora. For the grandchild he had watched most carefully and loved most specifically and worried about most quietly for decades. She set the letter down on the step beside her. She set the lantern on the step above. She folded her hands in her lap, and she cried. Not the hollow, exhausted crying of a woman who has been stripped of everything she built, but something entirely different. The crying of a woman who has been found. The crying of a person who has spent 8 months believing she was alone in the world and has just been handed irrefutable proof that she was never, not for a single day of her life, actually alone. She sat in the basement for a long time. When she finally came back upstairs, the October light had moved across the workshop floor, and the fire in the stove needed banking. She tended it. She put the kettle on. She sat on the 3-legged stool and opened Earl's first journal to the page she had left off and began to read properly, from the beginning, letting his voice fill the room around her the way a fire fills a room, not all at once, but steadily, until the cold is simply gone. She read for 3 hours. By the end of the first journal, she understood the full shape of what her grandfather had done and why. He had started saving in earnest the year she was born. He had made his first investment a modest one, through a banker in Frankfurt whom a neighbor had recommended the year she started school. He had added to it every year without exception, in amounts that varied with what the woodworking brought in, which had been more than anyone in the family suspected because Earl had sold his pieces not locally, where people would have known his business, but through a dealer in Louisville who had discovered him by accident in the late 60s, and had spent the next 20 years selling Earl Calloway's furniture to people who collected such things seriously. The 14 pieces upstairs in the open cell were the ones he had kept. Everything else had sold, and the money from those sales, added year by year to the investment account, had grown in the patient, unhurried way that money grows when you do not touch it and do not need to, and do not allow yourself to think of it as available because you have decided it belongs to someone else. It belonged to her. Ruth came the next morning with Cecily Marsh, who was 82 years old and walked with 2 canes and had the sharp, uncompromised eyes of a woman who has outlived most of the people who ever underestimated her. She stood in the doorway of the jailhouse for a full minute without speaking, taking in the open windows and the lit stove and Nora's coat on the hook by the door, and then she said, "He always said you'd come." Every time anyone asked him what he was doing in here, he said the same thing. "Keeping it ready for my Nora." We all thought he was being sentimental. He was being practical, Nora said. Cecily looked at her with those sharp eyes and smiled. "Yes," she said. "That was Earl exactly. Sentimental and practical in such equal measure that you couldn't tell them apart." They sat at the workbench with coffee, and Cecily talked for 2 hours. And through her talking, the full figure of Earl Calloway assembled itself in Nora's mind with a completeness she had never had access to before. Earl as a young man, Earl as a widower, Earl as a craftsman in the years when his reputation among collectors was quietly growing. Earl as an old man in this building doing the work of love that no one had thought to ask him about, because everyone assumed they already knew the shape of his life. "You were his favorite," Cecily said at one point, simply and without apology. "He didn't try to hide it. Your mother knew. She didn't mind. She understood why." "Why?" Nora asked. Cecily set down her coffee cup. "Because you were the most like Ida. Your grandmother. Same eyes, same way of holding still when something hurt you. Same way of making yourself small when the world got loud." She paused. Earl spent 40 years trying to fix the thing that made Ida small. He didn't manage it with her. She was already formed by the time he understood what she needed. But he thought maybe he could get it right the second time around. "Through you." Nora looked at the photograph on the wall of the finished room, visible through the open cell door. "She thought he did," she said quietly. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that define a life not through dramatic events, but through the accumulation of small, solid things. Doyle organized a crew of men from town, 3 of them, semi-retired, with the unhurried competence of people who learned their trades before shortcuts existed. And they spent 10 days going through the jailhouse from foundation to roof, assessing what needed attention and what had been maintained so well it needed none. The roof required new flashing at the chimney. 2 sections of the pine floor upstairs needed to be releveled. The plumbing, which Earl had roughed in but never completed, was brought fully functional by a plumber named Garrett who charged a fair price and refused to charge for the hours his teenage son spent clearing debris from the crawlspace because the boy had enjoyed it, he said, and learning to enjoy honest work was worth something. Nora paid for all of it from the savings passbook, which she had taken to the county bank in the first week, where a young manager named Harris had reviewed her documents with the careful attention of someone who wants to make absolutely certain he is understanding what he is looking at before he says anything. He had taken a long time. When he finally looked up, he said, "Mrs. Whitmore," and she had stopped him there, gently, and said, "Calloway. My name is Nora Calloway." And he had nodded and started again. "Mrs. Calloway, everything here is in order. The account is fully yours. The portfolio will need to be transferred to a current institution, which we can assist with. This will take a few weeks. But there are no complications and no liens, and no other parties with any claim." "There are no other parties," Nora confirmed. Harris nodded once more. "Then I think you'll find," he said, choosing his words with the care of a young man delivering news he is not certain will land well, "that you are in a considerably more comfortable position than you may currently feel you are." She had smiled at that. A real smile, the kind she had not produced in 8 months. "I suspect you're right," she said. By November, the jailhouse had electricity and running water and a small bathroom installed in the back corner of the main room. Ruth brought curtains deep green linen, which she said matched the armchair fabric she'd heard about from Doyle, though she had no explanation for how she knew what color Nora's armchair was. Cecily contributed a braided rug from her own house that she said she had too many of, which was demonstrably true. Nora put Earl's 14 pieces of furniture into their proper places throughout the building, and what had been a workshop became something that resembled, slowly and then all at once, a home. She planted bulbs along the south face of the building in early November, working in the cold with her gloves and a hand trowel, pushing tulip bulbs and daffodil bulbs into the dark soil at the base of the limestone wall, while her breath made small clouds in the air. She could not see them yet. She would not see them until spring. But they were there, doing their patient underground work, and she found she was comforted by that in a way she could not entirely explain. She had her grandfather's journals for the long evenings. She read them slowly, never more than 20 pages at a sitting, rationing them the way you ration the last of something irreplaceable. She read about his life in this building, his working methods, his thoughts about wood and craft, and the kind of patience that making things by hand requires. She read his observations about the town, the people in it, the slow changes of seasons in the hill country. She read, occasionally, about herself brief entries, a paragraph or two, noting something he had heard from her mother or something he had observed in a letter she had written him. Small reports on the life she was living in Frankfurt that he had followed from this distance with the quiet, steady attention of a man who had decided that paying attention was the primary way he could love from far away. The last journal entry was dated 2 weeks before his death. He had written, "I am satisfied. There is nothing more to add. What I built is built. What I saved is saved. What I meant to say has been written down. I hope she comes soon. I hope she comes before she has waited too long to enjoy it. But either way she will come, and either way it will be there. That is enough." Nora closed the third journal and held it in both hands in the warm lamplight of her grandfather's finished room, and she said aloud, to no one and to him, "I came, Grandpa. I came." The call from Priscilla came on a Thursday morning in December, 6 weeks after Nora had arrived in Greer's Hollow. Priscilla had heard things through the particular family telephone system that operates in most families without anyone quite designing it. A word from a cousin, a mention from someone who knew someone in Hart County, a careful inquiry made by Marcus to a man he knew in Frankfurt, who knew a lawyer who knew Harris at the county bank, and Harris, who was professional and discreet, had said nothing specific but had said it in a way that confirmed enough. "Mom," Priscilla said, "is it true?" Nora was standing at the workbench drinking her morning coffee and looking at the tulip bulbs in the small notebook where she had sketched the planting arrangement. "What specifically are you asking me, Priscilla?" Priscilla was quiet for a moment. "That Grandpa Earl left you something significant. Your great-grandfather left me what I needed," Nora said. "Mom." Priscilla's voice had something in it that Nora recognized. Not greed. Her daughter was not a greedy woman, but the particular discomfort of someone who realizes, too late, that they made an assumption that turned out to be wrong about the shape of another person's life. "Mom, I didn't know. About the jailhouse, about any of it. I want you to know I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Nora said. "I should have come to the courthouse." "Yes," Nora said. "You should have." A silence opened between them. A real one. Not the kind that can be filled with noise, but the kind that has to be sat with until it tells you what it is. "Can I come and see you?" Priscilla asked finally. "Just to see you." I'm not asking for anything, Mom. I just want to see where you are." Nora looked around the room. The green linen curtains on the windows. The braided rug from Cecily. Earl's candlestick on the workbench with a real candle in it now, burning. The photograph visible through the open cell door, Ida and 7-year-old Nora on the wall. "Come after Christmas," she said. "I'll have the second room finished by then." She heard her daughter exhale. "Thank you," Priscilla said quietly. "Mom, I'm sorry for what it cost you that I wasn't there." "I know," Nora said. "Come in January. We'll talk properly then." Marcus did not call. She had not expected him to. Marcus would take longer, and she was prepared to give him the time, not because she had forgiven the silence, but because she understood, as she had always understood about her son, that he needed to arrive at things slowly, or he would not arrive at them at all. He was his father's child in that way. She hoped, for his sake, that it was only that one way. Clyde she heard about not from Priscilla or Marcus, but from Connie LaRue, her attorney, who called on a gray December afternoon to update her on the post-divorce paperwork and mentioned, at the end of the call, with the careful neutrality of a professional person delivering information she suspects her client will receive with complicated feelings, that Clyde and Deanna Phelps had listed the farmhouse for sale in November. The market in that area, Connie said, had softened considerably since spring. They were having difficulty. Nora said thank you and ended the call. She stood at the window of the main room and looked out at Mill Road and Sycamore Lane in the December light, at the old iron hitching post that Doyle had straightened back to true on his second visit, at the stone building that Earl Calloway had sealed in 1989 and left for her as an act of faith across decades, and she felt about Clyde's difficulty what she had expected to feel, which was nothing at all. Not satisfaction, not relief, not the particular pleasure that cruelty sometimes promises and never quite delivers. Simply nothing. He was a man she had once loved and had been diminished by and had left behind, and his difficulty was his own and not connected to her anymore. She had ground under her feet. Real ground. Her name on the deed. Her grandfather's voice in 3 journals she had now read 3 times. The bulbs in the dark earth along the south wall, doing their patient work. She turned away from the window and went to put the kettle on. Winter deepened over Greer's Hollow. Snow came in January, proper hill country snow that settled thick and clean over Mill Road and the rooftops and the bare limbs of the old trees lining Sycamore Lane. Nora woke on the first heavy snow morning to a silence so complete it felt like permission to move slowly, to take up space, to exist at the pace she actually needed rather than the pace the world had always required of her. She made coffee. She built up the fire. She put on Earl's wool coat from the hook by the door, the one that had been hanging there since 1989 and fit her in the broad-shouldered, practical way of a coat made for utility rather than fashion, and she stepped outside onto Mill Road and stood in the snow in the early morning quiet with her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the building behind her. The limestone was pale gold in the winter light. The green curtains were visible through the front windows. Smoke rose from the chimney in a long, straight column in the windless air. A small wreath she had made from cedar branches hung on the iron-banded door. The tulip beds along the south wall were under snow now, invisible but present, the way things are present when they are working underground toward spring. It looked like a home, not a compromise or a shelter or a temporary arrangement, but a home, the kind of place that has been claimed by someone who intends to stay, that carries in its very appearance the decision of a woman who has decided this is where she belongs. She stood in the snow until the coffee was gone. Then she went inside. Priscilla came in January as promised, arriving on a Friday afternoon in a rental car from the Lexington airport with a careful, uncertain expression and a casserole dish she had carried from Frankfurt in an insulated bag, which was so precisely the kind of thing Priscilla did when she was nervous that Nora felt the last of her reserve soften at the sight of it. She showed her daughter the building room by room, the workshop and the tools, the open cell with its empty shelves now that the furniture had been distributed through the building, the finished room with Ida's photograph on the wall, the third journal, which she let Priscilla read the final entry of without explanation, the hatch in the floor. Priscilla descended into the basement. She was down there for a long time. When she came back up, her eyes were red and she did not offer any of the things Nora had half-expected: questions about the money, observations about what it might mean legally, careful inquiries about the estate. She simply looked at her mother standing in the middle of Earl Calloway's workshop in Earl Calloway's wool coat, and she said, "I didn't know what you came from. I always knew about Grandpa Earl, but I didn't know what you came from. Now you do," Nora said. "I'm sorry I didn't come to the courthouse." "I know," Nora said. "I know, baby." They ate Priscilla's casserole at the workbench that evening with the candle lit, and the fire going, and the snow falling outside the green curtain windows, and they talked for 4 hours the way mothers and daughters sometimes talk when the defenses are finally down, honestly, about real things, about the shape of the marriage and what it had taken from both of them in different ways, about Earl and Ida, and what had been preserved and why, and what it meant to receive something from the past, that the past had no obligation to leave you. By the time spring came to Greer's Hollow, the tulips had come up along the south wall, yellow and white and a deep, pure red that Nora had not planned for and could only attribute to her grandfather's original planting, bulbs sleeping in the dark for 30 years and coming back exactly as he had left them. She stood at the window on the March morning she first saw them and felt the particular quality of joy that belongs to things that survived what they had no business surviving, which is the best kind of joy and the rarest. She had established a routine by then that suited her as fully as any routine she had ever lived. She rose early. She tended the building, the way you tend a living thing, with daily attention to what it needed. She worked at Earl's bench 2 mornings a week. Learning from Doyle's patient instruction the basic woodworking skills her grandfather had never had the chance to pass directly: how to read grain, how to sharpen a chisel correctly, how to let the wood tell you what it wants to become rather than imposing a shape on it from outside. The furniture dealer in Louisville, the same house that had sold Earl's work for 30 years, had written to her after Doyle mentioned her name to a contact. They had asked, very carefully and respectfully, whether she had any pieces from Earl Calloway's final years that she would consider selling. She had written back and said no. She had then asked whether they might be interested in representing new work, her own, in the early stages of learning, with the full understanding that it would be years before anything was worth selling. The reply had come within a week. "We knew Earl Calloway for 30 years, they wrote. If you are willing to learn, we are willing to wait." She had framed that letter and put it on the wall of the finished room, next to Ida's photograph. Ruth brought the garden club in April. Cecily came twice a week regardless, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, to drink coffee and read from the Hart County Historical Archive she had been compiling for 15 years, and to which Nora had contributed Earl's journals in the form of transcribed copies, keeping the originals in their proper place on the desk in the finished room. A woman named Bet arrived from the next county over, having heard about the building through Cecily's historical network, a 71-year-old retired schoolteacher who had grown up in Greer's Hollow and left at 18 and spent 50 years wondering what she had left behind. She sat at the workbench on her first visit and looked at Earl's tools on the pegboard and burst into tears without warning, and then immediately composed herself and said, "I knew your grandfather. He was a remarkable man." Nora had poured her coffee and said, "I know. Tell me something about him I don't already have written down." But had stayed for 3 hours. She came back the following Tuesday. On a warm May evening, Nora sat on the front step of the jailhouse with a cup of tea cooling in her hands and watched the last of the day's light move across Mill Road and Sycamore Lane. The lilac she had planted beside the hitching post was beginning to set buds. The tulips had finished and been replaced with something lower and persistent that she had not planted and suspected were her grandfather's doing across whatever gap of time separates intention from outcome. The building behind her was warm and lit and entirely itself, and she was entirely herself inside it. She thought about Clyde, briefly, in the way you think about weather that has passed. She thought about the farmhouse with its garden she had watered for 40 years, and its porch she had painted twice, and its nursery that Tatum was repainting for a child that was not hers, and she felt about all of it the clean, uncomplicated absence of feeling that means you are finally done. Not healed exactly. She did not believe in healing as a destination, as a state you arrived at and then stayed in. She believed in days, in the accumulation of days that were better than the ones before, in the slow replacement of one kind of life with another. She was 74 years old. She had ground under her feet. She had her grandfather's voice in 3 journals on a desk in a room he had finished for her and left her photograph on the wall of. She had 22 acres of timber and pasture running east along Sycamore Lane with a creek that had never run dry in living memory. She had a workbench and a pegboard full of tools and a patient dealer in Louisville willing to wait years for her work to be worth selling. She had Ruth and Cecily and Doyle and Bet and Priscilla who came once a month now and stayed the weekend and was learning, slowly, to be quiet in the way the building required. She had the bulbs in the dark earth that came back every spring as they had always come back, patient and unhurried and absolutely certain of themselves. She had everything. She lifted her cup. The evening settled around her. The lilac beside the hitching post trembled once in a breath of warm air and was still. "Thank you, Grandpa," she said, to the limestone and the May evening and the 30 years of careful, stubborn love that had been waiting here at the end of Mill Road for her to finally come and claim it. The building behind her held its warmth. The creek on the eastern boundary ran on. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.